Good afternoon. Welcome back to another round of Ask the Pastor. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the things that I really enjoyed working with over the years as a pastor. I love doing research into the biblical material. I enjoy the work of a biblical scholar. I've taken commentaries on vacation to read as I relax. It's something I enjoy. Now, one of the things that I enjoy about doing the research into the biblical material is really coming to understand how the Bible works. When I say that, I mean how it interacts with itself, how it relates to other portions. So today we're going to talk about just for a little bit is the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, meaning they come from the same perspective, the same viewpoint. They essentially follow the same chronology and are easy to see the way that they differ, largely because they have essentially the same structure. There are some significant differences between them, don't get me wrong, but essentially they do have the same chronology. Gospel of John, on the other hand, is an entirely different sort of thing. The chronology in the Gospel of John follows a different path. It is entirely different. To give you the clear example of this, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find 1 year, less than a year passing. There is one recorded trip to Jerusalem for Passover. In the Gospel of John, Jesus makes at least 3 trips to Jerusalem as an adult, perhaps 4. Now, you'll notice there are stories in Matthew, in Mark, and in Luke that are essentially the same. Now, take the Lord's Prayer, for example. It exists in both Matthew and in Luke in different forms. They're similar, they're recognizable, you can tell they come from the same source, but they don't exist at all in the Gospel of Mark. That seems odd. Why would one gospel writer include it and not the others? Well, these things happen frequently. So we have to ask the question, how does it work? Now, each of the Gospels functions with the apostolic support of one of Jesus' disciples, the apostles. For the Gospel of Mark, it's the Apostle Peter. Mark, or John Mark as he is known, is said to have recorded the preaching of Peter. Not every sermon, but distilled it down into a story about who Jesus was. Matthew is typically assumed to be not only have the agency of the Apostle Matthew as its support, but to record the preaching of the Gospel of Matthew. The Apostle Matthew, not the Gospel of Matthew, excuse me. Luke, on the other hand, has his apostolic support through the Apostle Paul. And he records Paul's preaching, not one of the other apostles. Now, they do have their variances. Luke picks up much more concern for the poor, the outcast, and women than what you find in Mark or in Matthew. If you ask the question, which of these was written first, to maybe help sort out some of these differences, traditionally it is understood that Matthew wrote first. And that's the reason for his placement in the canon. Matthew writes first, so his gospel is included first. Then Mark writes, then Luke writes, then John writes. It's reasonable. It makes sense until you start looking closely. And one of the things you'll notice is that Mark almost seems to be a shortened version of the Gospel of Matthew. Same chronology, it doesn't have nearly as much detail. There are no birth narratives, for example. There's no long preaching sections like we find in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. You find many of the same stories, but again, they tend to be shorter and truncated. And scholars for a long time thought that what happened is that Mark simply shortened Matthew's work. Well, there's another way to approach it that I think makes more sense. And that is to assume that Mark wrote first and really serves as the template that both Matthew and Luke then follow. Now, each gospel has something unique to itself. Mark has stories that Luke, Matthew do not include. Matthew has stories that Luke does not include. And Luke has stories that Matthew does not include, that you won't find in Mark either. So each of the authors had access to a collection of information about Jesus that the others didn't, or chose not to use for whatever the case may be. So we've talked about this at times as Matthew having his own community that he's writing for, a target audience, a group that he wants to share the gospel with. And so in doing this, he doesn't tell them everything. He tells them the story, but he includes what he thinks will be helpful for them. You'll notice that in Matthew's gospel, there's a lot of conflict with the Pharisees. Probably the group that is most closely related to the Christians at the time, and also one of the chief antagonists. You don't see that in the Gospel of Luke at all. It's not nearly as important to the narrative, and the stories are different. Many suggest that Matthew is writing for a Jewish Christian, or even a Jewish audience that may be interested in the things of Jesus. Luke is most likely writing for Gentiles. You'll even find that words are translated for us in the text. But both Matthew and Luke follow the same structure that Mark sets out with initially. Now, Mark has its own set of problems. You'll notice that there's no birth narratives at all in the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. It begins with Jesus' baptism, as if anything before roughly the age of 30 just didn't matter. Now, it's not that Matthew includes a whole lot more. There are birth stories, yes, but there's not much information from the time of Jesus' birth until he enters public ministry. In the Gospel of Luke, you find something similar, more stories around the birth than what we find in Matthew, certainly more than in Mark. But Luke doesn't say much about Jesus' growing up years, with the exception of one incident, a trip when he was 12 to the city of Jerusalem for Passover, which is probably a trip the family made on a regular basis. Now, why this one time did Jesus decide to stay? It's a good question. Luke includes it. Why? I can't tell you the answer to that question. But he does. And it's really the only information we have between birth and ministry about what Jesus was like. The Gospels, particularly the Synoptics, present unique challenges in that. They help us to see the story of Jesus, but each one gives a unique perspective. Clearly, when you read the Gospel of Mark, you will notice the urgency. In the King James, it says straightway. The NIV says immediately. It happened immediately, and then he did this immediately. There's an urgency there. There's a need to tell the story for people to hear the gospel. And Mark carries that urgency in a way that no one else does. Matthew gives us a unique insight into Jesus' teaching by recording this large block of preaching in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. The Sermon on the Mount is this rich collection of the sayings of Jesus. I've often likened it to a stump speech for students to understand what's going on here. I'm not sure this was a sermon that was just preached once in one place, but I suspect this is a sermon that Jesus preached in numerous places at numerous times, maybe adjusting the details a little bit here and there, local connections or whatnot, much like politicians do when they are out speaking on the stump, when they're when they're taking the message out to people. They tell the same stories. They use the same um, speech with variations to the local audience to adjust it so that they can understand. And I assume that Mark heard this. I'm sorry, that Matthew heard this preaching on numerous occasions and knew it. He may have been able to preach the sermon himself. It's not terribly long. It's all of 3 chapters and fairly easily memorized. Yet, it gives us this large collection of the sayings, the teachings of Jesus. The only other place we find something similar to this is really the Gospel of Thomas, one of the non-canonical Gospels, where there's a large collection of the sayings of Jesus. It's not a gospel in the sense of what we think of as a gospel. It doesn't go through birth narratives, doesn't walk through the life of Jesus, doesn't take us to the crucifixion. It's simply a collection of the sayings of Jesus. Sometimes you'll find this with things that are called Gospels that are not included in the New Testament. And that's not to say that they weren't important at some point. It's not even to say that they don't have value now, but they didn't meet the criteria that we find in the Gospels themselves. Well, hey, I hope this was helpful in understanding a little bit of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you have questions, let me know. I look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks a lot.